Everyone expected Canada to follow the US trade policy on Chinese electric vehicles. Everyone was wrong. On January 16th, 2026, Prime Minister Mark Carney announced that Canada would completely eliminate the 100% tariff it imposed on Chinese electric vehicles in exchange for access to the agricultural market. Trump expected Canada to have no choice but to comply with his strategy of containing China. However, he realized that Carney had opted for economic pragmatism over American demands, and that the Canadian public supported this break. Dear followers, Canada has deviated from the most important American trade policy in modern history. While Donald Trump maintains the 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles and threatens even higher tariffs, Prime Minister Carney announced this morning that Canada will lower its tariffs and allow imports of Chinese electric vehicles under a quota system. This is not just a trade adjustment. Canada is declaring that American pressure will not dictate its economic policy. This announcement came as Carney stood alongside President Xi Jinping in Beijing, clearly demonstrating that Canada's pivot to China is not a temporary tactic, but a deliberate strategy. The numbers establish the framework. Canada will initially allow 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles to enter under reduced tariffs. That quota will grow to 70,000 vehicles over 5 years. In exchange, China will slash its tariffs on Canadian canola seed from approximately 84% to approximately 15%, reopening a $4 billion market for prairie farmers. Think about that for a moment. Trump demands Canada maintain punitive tariffs on Chinese goods. Carney responds by cutting tariffs to serve Canadian interests. Trump threatens consequences for countries that don't align with American policy. Carney demonstrates that middle powers can resist great power coercion when they possess economic leverage. The timing is extraordinary. Trump just announced he would impose 35% tariffs on most Canadian goods starting August 1st, 2026, an increase from the current 25% rate. His letter to Carney explicitly warned that tariffs may be modified upward if Canada retaliates or refuses compliance. Yet hours after receiving that threat, Carney stood in Beijing announcing agreements that directly contradict American demands. Let that sink in. Trump threatens higher tariffs if Canada doesn't comply. Carney immediately announces deals with China that Trump explicitly opposes. The geopolitical message could not be clearer. Canada will not accept American ultimatums about which countries we can trade with or what policies we must adopt. Jacob Cook, CEO of WPIC Marketing Plus Technologies and a Canadian business owner in China, called Carney's visit game-changing. He explained, "It reestablishes dialogue, respect, and a framework between the two nations. These three things we didn't have. The parties were not talking for years. Those three elements, dialogue, respect, framework, represent exactly what Canada lacks in its relationship with the United States under Trump. No meaningful dialogue, just ultimatums. No respect, just threats and annexation jokes. No framework, just chaotic policy reversals. If Canada must choose between a partner who offers dialogue and one who demands subordination, Carney's choice becomes obvious. If you believe Canada's sovereignty means making independent trade decisions regardless of American pressure, subscribe to this channel and enable notifications. What happened in Beijing this morning will reshape how middle powers respond to great power coercion, and you deserve to understand why it matters. For those who remember when Canadian trade policy operated independently from American demands, this moment represents both a departure and a return. Departure from the recent pattern of automatic alignment with Washington. Return to Canada's historical tradition of pursuing independent foreign economic policy. The timeline explains how Canada arrived at 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs in the first place. In 2024, under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, the Biden administration imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, citing unfair Chinese state subsidies that gave manufacturers competitive advantages. Canada followed suit, imposing identical 100% tariffs along with 25% duties on Chinese steel and aluminum. Trudeau justified these actions by arguing that Chinese subsidies created an unfair advantage in the global marketplace. The policy aligned perfectly with American strategy of containing Chinese technological advancement and protecting North American auto manufacturing. For Canada, which produces significant auto parts and some vehicle assembly, the logic appeared sound. But here's the problem with that approach. When Canada imposed those tariffs, China retaliated immediately by targeting Canadian agriculture. Beijing slapped approximately 84% combined tariffs on Canadian canola seed, the result of regular duties plus anti-dumping measures. Prairie farmers, who had nothing to do with electric vehicle policy, absorbed billions in lost exports because Canada aligned with American trade strategy. The cruel irony is that Canada paid the price for American alignment while receiving no American support. Trump imposed his own tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and other goods. He threatened Canadian auto manufacturing with Section 232 tariffs. He suggested Canada might become America's 51st state, yet he expected Canada to maintain anti-China policies that hurt Canadian farmers in service of American geopolitical objectives. Carney understood immediately that this framework was unsustainable. As he told CBC News last month, "Never have all your eggs in one basket. We have too many eggs in the American basket." The Beijing agreements represent the most dramatic manifestation of that diversification strategy. Remember when Canadian leaders made independent judgments about Canadian interests rather than reflexively following American policy? When Canada negotiated free trade with the United States as equals rather than subordinates? This echoes an understanding that sovereignty means the right to disagree with powerful neighbors when Canadian interests demand different approaches. The numbers tell an extraordinary story about how Canadian public opinion shifted. According to Pew Research Center polling, conducted in 2025, 34% of Canadians now have a favorable opinion of China, up from just 21% before Trump took office. Meanwhile, favorable views of the United States dropped from 54% to 34%. As NBC News reported, the two countries now sit at exactly equal favorability among Canadians. But it gets worse for American leverage. The EV agreement Canada negotiated with China includes specific quotas designed to balance multiple Canadian interests. The initial cap of 49,000 vehicles protects Canadian auto assembly jobs while allowing significant Chinese imports. The growth to 70,000 over 5 years provides predictability for industry planning. Here's where it gets interesting. Chinese electric vehicles typically sell for $10,000 to $20,000 less than equivalent North American models. That price advantage comes partly from Chinese state subsidies, but also from manufacturing scale, battery technology leadership, and integrated supply chains. For Canadian consumers facing high vehicle costs, Chinese EVs represent affordable transportation options. Ontario Premier Doug Ford opposes the deal, arguing that Chinese EV imports threaten Canadian auto manufacturing jobs. Ford maintained that 100% tariffs were essential to protecting domestic jobs. Yet Ford's analysis ignores several realities. First, Canadian auto manufacturing primarily produces parts and components rather than complete vehicles. The number of Canadians employed in final vehicle assembly is relatively small. Second, affordable EVs accelerate Canada's transition away from fossil fuel vehicles, a climate policy objective supported by most Canadians. Third, the quota system limits imports to levels that won't devastate domestic production. Think about that for a moment. Canada gets $3 billion in agricultural market access. Canadian consumers get access to affordable electric vehicles. Canada advances climate goals by accelerating EV adoption. And the cost, allowing 49,000 Chinese vehicles annually in a market that sells approximately 2 million vehicles total. The strategic calculation strongly favors the agreement, but the real story is even more remarkable. By breaking with American policy on Chinese EVs, Canada establishes precedent that other American allies might follow. If Canada can negotiate independent deals with China despite American pressure, why can't European countries, Latin American nations, or Asian allies do the same? Trump's strategy of forcing allied alignment through threats may have just suffered its most significant defeat. During his Beijing meetings, Carney engaged with Contemporary Amperex Technology, CATL, the world's largest EV battery manufacturer. CATL already invested in Canadian LNG projects. The question is whether CATL might also invest in Canadian battery manufacturing, creating jobs and technology transfer benefits beyond simple vehicle imports. For those who understand that economic policy should serve Canadian interests rather than American geopolitical objectives, share your thoughts in the comments below. This generation faces a choice between accepting subordination to American demands or asserting Canada's right to make independent trade decisions. Carney chose independence, and the economic benefits prove that sovereignty pays dividends. Trump supporters argue that Canada's EV deal with China betrays Western democratic solidarity and undermines efforts to counter Chinese technological dominance. They claim Carney sacrificed long-term alliance relationships for short-term economic gains. But here's the problem with that argument. Alliance relationships require mutual respect and reciprocal benefits. Trump has demonstrated neither toward Canada. He imposed 35% tariffs on Canadian goods. He threatened to make Canada the 51st state. He suspended trade talks because Ontario aired advertisements criticizing his tariffs. He demanded Canada drop its digital services tax targeting US technology firms. At what point does alliance become subordination? When does partnership mean simply obeying American diktat? Carney's Beijing agreements answer those questions clearly. Canada will engage allies respectfully, but will not accept ultimatums that harm Canadian interests. Other critics argue that China cannot be trusted to honor trade commitments and that Beijing will reimpose barriers once political objectives are achieved. They point to China's history of using economic coercion for geopolitical leverage. Here's the cruel irony. Over the past year, Canada's most unreliable trading partner has been the United States. Trump imposed tariffs in February, suspended some in April, reimposed higher rates in June, threatened even higher duties in August, and now promises 35% tariffs starting this August unless Canada complies with various demands. Chinese trade policy, while protectionist, has at least been consistent and negotiable through diplomatic channels. The reality is that Trump's approach created exactly the outcome he claims to fear. If Trump had treated Canada respectfully, if he had negotiated trade issues constructively, if he had supported Canadian farmers hurt by Chinese retaliation from policies Canada adopted at American urging, Carney might have maintained tighter alignment. Instead, Trump's coercion pushed Canada toward Beijing. But the real story is even more significant. The EV deal proves that middle powers can successfully play great powers against each other when they possess economic leverage. Canada had what China wanted, agricultural products. China had what Canada wanted, affordable EVs and agricultural market access. Neither country required American permission to negotiate mutually beneficial arrangements. This represents a fundamental shift in how middle powers respond to great power competition. Rather than simply choosing sides, Canada demonstrated that independent foreign economic policy serves national interests better than reflexive alignment with either Beijing or Washington. This is what sovereignty means when tested by great power pressure. Not isolation from either the United States or China, but independent judgment about which policies serve Canadian interests. Not reflexive opposition to American requests, but clear refusal of American ultimatums. The EV deal signed in Beijing this morning establishes that Canada will make trade policy based on Canadian economic needs, rather than American geopolitical preferences. Trump can threaten higher tariffs. He can suggest annexation. He can demand compliance. But he cannot prevent Canada from negotiating agreements with other partners who treat us respectfully. The next few months will prove crucial. Chinese EVs will begin arriving under the quota system. Canadian farmers will see canola exports resume to China. Public opinion polling will reveal whether Canadians support Carney's independent approach or prefer alignment with American demands. And Trump will certainly escalate pressure through higher tariffs or other coercive measures. Each American threat will validate Carney's diversification strategy. Each example of Trump's disrespect will justify deeper partnerships with countries that negotiate as equals. Each attempt to subordinate Canada will demonstrate why sovereignty requires alternatives to American dependence. The broader implications extend beyond Canada. American allies worldwide are watching how Trump treats Canada, America's closest neighbor, largest trading partner, and most reliable military ally. If Trump threatens annexation and imposes punitive tariffs on Canada, why would any country trust American partnership? Carney's Beijing agreements show allies that alternatives exist when Washington demands subordination. For those who remember when Canadian leaders navigated great power competition without surrendering sovereignty, this moment feels like a return to something essential about Canadian identity. Not anti-American, but absolutely independent. Not pro-China, but willing to engage pragmatically when it serves Canadian interests. If you want to continue following Canada's emergence as a truly sovereign middle power, subscribe to this channel and enable notifications. Share this video with Canadians who deserve to understand how the EV agreement serves both economic interests and climate goals. And leave your thoughts in the comments below, especially if you understand why independent trade policy strengthens rather than weakens Canada's international position. Canada did not choose this confrontation with the United States. Trump forced it through threats, tariffs, and disrespect. But now that the confrontation exists, Carney is demonstrating that Canada possesses both economic alternatives and diplomatic credibility to chart an independent course. That is what leadership looks like under pressure. That is what sovereignty means in practice. And that is why the EV deal announced in Beijing this morning matters far beyond the specific quota numbers or tariff rates. The world is watching middle powers assert independence from great power coercion. Canada just showed them how it's done. And the combination of economic benefits, climate progress, and sovereign decision-making proves that independence delivers better results than subordination.